Today's lesson will walk you through the entire process of writing a personal narrative. We recommend you come back to this lesson several times and rewatch as many times as you wish. We suggest pausing the video and really paying close attention to every step of the writing process. In addition to this instructional video, you have several resources available to you below. Here is an example of a personal narrative rubric. A rubric is a guide for what you should include in an assignment. As outlined in this rubric, you will want to include all of these things in your personal narrative. So, what should be included in a personal narrative? First, you want to plan your writing. I highly recommend doing this on paper first, and you can either use a plot map, you can use the pictures in a storyboard, which can be found in the creative options below, but my favorite way of planning a narrative is using the standard Strive to Write 6 rectangle plan. Once you have planned your narrative and you're ready to go to a document and write it, you will want to start with writing a lively lead. A lively lead is a way to capture your reader so they get hooked and want to read more. You may pause this video to view some of the examples here of ways in which you can hook your audience. The next part of composing a personal narrative is writing your paint the picture. The paint the picture, once again, is like the exposition in your plot line. This is where you're going to want to include any background information about the characters, maybe where the story is taking place, the time of year if that's relevant. Any information that's going to guide and help your reader follow your story should be included in the paint the picture. Next, you're going to want to include the beginning, which includes a conflict. Maybe use those guiding words of somebody wanted to help you in identifying what that conflict might be. After writing the beginning, you will want 2 or 3 M's for middles. This includes your rising action events, climax, and falling action. Next, you will want to make sure you include a balance of dialogue throughout the story. Narrating is when you're telling the story using your own words, and adding that dialogue is when you add that conversation back and forth. Next, you will want to make sure to include the end. The end is your resolution in your plot. Remember, this should connect somehow back to the conflict and make the story come full circle. Once you have finished your rough draft of your personal narrative, you're going to want to revise and edit, which means going back and rereading it multiple times. You're going to want to try your best to include proper grammar and punctuation in your writing, as this is very important. If you believe you need more guidance with this, you may be interested in purchasing the Strive to Write Grammar and Punctuation Essentials to further guide you. And the last thing on your rubric is to illustrate your story. This course offers you several options for how to illustrate your story, including a basic drawing, a digital Google slide presentation, and or a storyboard. All of these lessons can be found under the Creative Options section of this course. In addition to the rubric, we highly recommend you print all the other reference sheets included as part of this lesson. Here is a reference sheet that can guide you in what each part of the narrative should include. We have also included a beginners and advancing writing template if you believe this would be helpful. You will also find copies of personal narratives, including the example of the Tower of Terror story, which I use as a guide in this lesson. Finally, we included a highlighted version of the Tower of Terror, which offers an explanation and breakdown of each important element that should be included in a personal narrative. Let's get started in the process of writing a personal narrative. The first step is to set up your notebook so you can plan your story. How I am modeling it here is Strive to Write's recommended way of planning a narrative. You want to break your paper into 6 to 7 sections, which will represent each of the important parts of your story. You will want to include the LL for lively lead, the PP for paint the picture, B for beginning, 2 or sometimes 3 M's for the middles, and E for the end. Next, you're going to jot down the basic events or elements that you want to include in your story. I sometimes skip the lively lead or maybe just write down ideas for how I want to start it, just like a simple word such as dialogue lead. You can always come back to this later. This should not take more than 10 to 15 minutes tops. You do not need complete sentences on your plan. As you can see here, I am just including little bullets or notes. Later, you will use this as a reference when you go to write the actual story, which will be the next step. You may pause here to take a peek at my plan for the Tower of Terror personal narrative. Now you will want to open a document to do the actual writing of your personal narrative. You can simply open a blank doc or use one of our personal narrative writing templates. I'm going to use the beginner's template for modeling this assignment. Remind you, anything in red is just there as a guide and should be deleted and turned to black. Also, when writing your story, you will not want to just copy your plan. A plan is intended to be there as a guide, but your actual writing should be much more detailed and include complete sentences. Now it's time to write. The personal narrative that I have chosen to write about is the time we went to Disney and went on the ride, the Tower of Terror. I started my story with a lively lead, which is a little bit of both a talking lead and a flashback, giving the reader just enough information to want to read on to find out what happened. You will want to make sure to indent for each different part of your story. By doing this, you hit Enter and then Tab. If you are not familiar with indenting for each paragraph, I recommend you play with it a little bit so you can make sure to structure your writing in a way that ends up looking similar to mine. Next, you will write the paint the picture, which is the exposition in the plotline of your story. This includes any information that your reader needs to know in order to follow your story. For my paint the picture, I included who was with me, what time of year it was, and some details about why some of us were in Disney before others. These details provide an important background so that readers can follow the story and not have any questions about who is who, etc. One more thing to note about the paint the picture is that I do not include dialogue in this part of the story. You're just explaining that background information so that you can get into the rest of the storytelling. Next, you will want to indent and write the beginning of your story. Remember, this is the part of the story which includes a conflict. From my before or after the quote. These are examples of dialogue tags. Any words that indicate that someone is talking is considered a dialogue tag. So words such as said, asked, shouted, replied, cried, questioned, those are all dialogue tags. I'm going to use this example here to guide you in some of the basics that should be included when punctuating dialogue. So let's break this down. First of all, it's important to remember to indent whenever a new person is talking. Your best reference for what this looks like are in my examples below, but even better, the narrative books that you are reading. Pay attention to how dialogue is punctuated. Even copy some examples in your notebook. So when including quotations, aka dialogue, you will want to hit Shift in this key here. One basic rule of thumb is there is almost always a capital inside the quote for dialogue, unless the dialogue is interrupted by the dialogue tag, like you can see in this example here. Also, you will always want to have punctuation inside the quote, like you see in my example here as well. Notice how I make sure to indent, include the capital inside the quote, and punctuation inside the quote. After the beginning, which includes the initial conflict that drives the rest of the story, you will want to write the as we were just getting on the ride. The suspense was building in my rising action as we were trying to figure out what this ride was all about. The climax hits as we are on the ride, and although it was as terrifying as can be, it was also thrilling. I then wrote my falling action, which included coming off the ride in shock, and then of course the end was describing how the ride on the Tower of Terror ended up being the best part of our entire vacation. Make sure to read the full personal narrative example of the Tower of Terror, which is attached below. As a quick recap, make sure to print the resources that we have attached below, or at least have them open in tabs for you to look at throughout the writing process. Start by planning your personal narrative on paper first. Next, go to a blank doc or use one of our templates to guide you in actually writing your story. Make sure to balance narration and dialogue in a narrative, except for the paint the picture. Once again, also make sure to come back to this instructional video anytime you feel compelled to write a personal narrative. There are numerous resources to guide you, which we hope you use. Most importantly, have fun.